Hey, how's it going, everybody? I'm Tom Delgado. Good to see you again. I'm here today to speak to an expert on a field that is very important today, a historian, of course. We're going to be talking about the political climate and all those things. But before I ramble myself in outer space, I want to introduce him. To my left here is a professor at Princeton University. He wrote this book recently called In Defense of Partisanship. It's kind of like a history of the party system here in the United States, as well as editing this book, Myth America, as well as many other books. He's also got a Substack, new Substack,
I do.
just a few days old.
The Long View.
You got to get in there early to the Long View on Substack. Please, welcome, I guess, from your chairs there. Julian Zelizer, how you doing?
Thanks, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. Really, very nice of you to have us here. I guess just to get started, there's so much to talk about. Yep. I guess I'll do it open-ended and we'll go from there. Sure. How did we get here with the party system, with the hyper-partisanship, if you want to talk about that or whatever? How did we end up in this moment?
I mean, I think there's several things at work. One are the divisions over different issues that have been bubbling up at least since the 1960s. On issues like reproductive rights, on debates and struggles over race relations, and even economic policy. So you've had social movements fighting this out and intensifying the fight. I think the media environment's changed a lot, really since that 1970s period. First, you had 24-hour news with cable, which just created constant search for content and often sensational content. And then just the total fragmentation of the media with social media in the computer age, which created a filterless environment where divisive issues found a much easier way to mainstream dialogue than before. And finally, you do have partisanship. The parties moved farther apart. You had less of a center. But most important, the Republican Party really radicalized since the 1990s, moving much further to the right in terms of policy. And just as important, becoming much more aggressive in what the party saw as permissible in partisan warfare. And you add all of that together, and you get the brew, I think, that created the Trump presidencies.
Mm-hmm. Now, in what you just said, what role would, let's say, because you did your essay in Myth America was on the Reagan Revolution. Yeah. Now, during Reagan, you had a lot of deregulation. You had people making a lot of money. You had this kind of climb towards the wealthiest, in the country got wealthier, the divide between the lower class, all that. What role, because a lot of people speak to the role of inequality in all of this, and also in fomenting all of this and making it worse, exacerbating it. What role would you say that has played in the divisiveness we have today?
That was an important decade for shifts in economic policy. I mean, Reagan takes a stab at some of the ideas that had been prevalent since the 1930s. He pushes for deregulation of many parts of industry. He pushes a huge tax cut in 1981 that really benefits upper income Americans as opposed to middle and working class Americans. And that isn't just a one-time bill, kind of sets the precedent for future presidents, both the deregulation and the tax cut. So you see inequality increase in the 1980s, and that hasn't stopped. So that is part of it. You also see just a secular change in the economy. A lot of the core areas of the economy from the 40s and 50s, the manufacturing areas, states like Michigan or parts of Pennsylvania, shift from being booming economic areas where people were unionized, where they could expect secure jobs with benefits, to the Rust Belt, where there was nothing really there. And the new industries are not jobs that provide a lot of security and benefits. So some of it's policy and politics in that Reagan era is important. Some of it related is this bigger shift in the economy. And I do think it's pretty clear, not only has inequality increased, but middle class security has decreased. So even if you're in the middle class, you're often working multiple jobs, you're not sure about what's around the corner, and you don't have that stability that had become pretty established for a lot of Americans in the 50s and 60s.
One of the things I'd be curious to know also is the inequality on its own is bad, but then with regards to what you were just saying, the role inequality plays as well with, let's say, how companies affect politics, campaign finance, the regulations against media, for example, in the 80s that were rolled back, allowing things like what we have today to happen, as well as, like even going to Citizens United more recently. All of these things are also a result of inequality. do you think that it could have played a more active, that it did play a more active role in kind of putting us where we are?
Well, it does. I mean, you see a huge expansion in business and their presence in Washington. Same period, 70s and 80s. Part of it is the campaign finance reforms that come after Watergate, which actually try to curb a lot of this. Some remain in place, some are undercut. There's a Supreme Court decision in 1976, Buckley v. Vallejo, that prohibits the campaign spending limits that the Congress had put into place. And so you have this big mobilization of money, and the biggest sources of money tend to be corporations or trade associations or increasingly individual lobbyists who independently have many dollars to spend. And so that matters. I mean, I don't think having big contributions guarantees anything, but if both parties, and it was both parties, are hearing more and more from lobbyists and contributors who have that interest in mind and thinking about them, it's going to affect public policy. And remember, this is the same time as these dollars are increasing from the corporate world that unions are diminishing as a presence because that manufacturing sector is going away. So they play less of a role. So the main voice kind of pushing for working Americans at a very real level and consistent level is diminishing as a political force.
Which also could have been a result of the influence of corporations who don't like unions as well. That reminds me of I'm sure you're familiar with the Powell Memo of the early 70s. Where
71.
So if you guys don't know, Lewis Powell, who was at the time, I believe, was the general counsel for the Chamber of Commerce, wrote this memo to basically the members of the Chamber of Commerce, who are businesses, big businesses, basically saying, look, the 60s was a disaster for us. We lost a lot of our power over individuals, civil rights, all these things, got people different rights and a voice. We got to basically unite and do something about this. Go figure, he becomes a Supreme Court justice just very, very soon thereafter. And this kind of sets the stage for basically what we're seeing today, which is just, you have people now like, Musks and Zuckerbergs, everyone very involved in politics. And it was kind of that a lot of people point to that moment as being that kind of beginning of that movement. So just to keep moving, I guess, here, your book, In Defense of Partisanship, you talk about, and I thought it was really interesting because so many people point to our two-party system in the United States as being a big reason why we are where we are, as being a problem. I guess, how do you defend it right now? I guess, how would you defend what's happening right now? To me, my instinct in reading the book and everything would be, how do we avoid it seems almost inevitable that hyper-partisanship would be the result. It's almost a matter of well, why wouldn't we be hyper-partisan at some point? So how would you make sense of what's happening now?
I mean, we've had parties since the start in this country, and they haven't always acted this way. They've been problematic. They've supported bad policies, but they haven't always been in a place where what you see today, where literally anything goes. It was not inevitable. We've had very strong parties, and strong parties practically are just very important in this country. They are needed to represent differing viewpoints within the political system. They're needed to generate big ideas. All the big moments, whether it was FDR in the 30s or Reagan in the 80s, if you're a conservative, are tied to strong parties pushing the nation one way or another. And they're also just important at connecting voters when they work well to Washington, or else the disconnect grows bigger. So what we often focus on today is not that, which has been so elemental to politics. It's this hyper-partisan Republican Party, and it's a one-party problem. I mean, I do argue that, where they've abandoned concerns of governing, they've abandoned concerns of the health of the democratic institutions, which were always balanced with tough partisans in this country. And so somehow we need a way to get it back. And some of that is institutional reform. I talk about taking away weapons of partisan mass destruction. Some of it is hard. It's norms. You need a generation of leaders who get that this is totally destructive. So it ranges from reform to norms to leadership, but it's essential. And look, some people want a totally new system. Maybe we'll get it. I don't think that's in the foreseeable future. So what we really need to work on is reining back what the last 20 years have brought.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that because in addition to the problems you have, let's say with the procedural elements, and you talk about like the filibuster, all these different things that are a problem, you also have then the media on top of it and how they spin it to where people don't necessarily realize these are a problem, or people are misinformed as to what the role these things play. And I think that's another part of it. The culture has to change. People have to demand different things from their politicians and all that as well. You kind of hit on this too, but I think it's worth mentioning is the I guess the culture of the political party too has changed, and I think this is something that we're all kind of feeling the effects of. And you mentioned in the book how parties used to be a part of your life.
Yeah.
Today we're very partisan. People have their beliefs and they're one team and everything, but it doesn't play a role in their day-to-day life. Back in the day, you'd go down to the Democratic, club or whatever. You'd also interact with the other party, and you was kind of in a political debate or whatever, those types of things. And today that's not the case. How do we go back on that at this point?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very dangerous situation.
Yeah.
So you have people who are furious with each other, very firm in their commitment, but they don't actually connect to these institutions.
They're isolated.
Compared to the 19th century. So I do talk, there are conversations now about how to do it. And some of it's very small, practical steps that some members are trying with new technology to just basically expand their interaction with voters in new kinds of town halls. They're even looking at specialized conversations with different trade groups or different social groups to kind of think of ways to bring people in. Obviously, voting rights is another essential part of what you're talking about, because people have to feel the stability and commitment of their ability to vote on voting day before they're going to integrate. A bigger reform that I talk about beyond the smaller measures is expanding the House of Representatives.
Right.
And that's a big one because we are outdated. The size of the House no longer fits the size of the country. So districts are like the size of a state.
Right.
Members, even well-intentioned, are not going to see most people and figure out how to kind of have FaceTime with them.
Yeah.
And we need smaller districts. So those are all like a bunch of things I have in the book that I think are really important. Otherwise, we're going to continue with basically sending a text is the sum total of what you do.
Yeah, and there was a great quote in the book where it was said, I think it was Julian Zelizer, says, we have weak parties and strong partisanship, which sounds like a recipe for disaster, really.
Exactly.
Okay, so going back to what you were mentioning about the Republican Party kind of being the driver of the way partisanship looks these days, I guess, when would you kind of start this kind of movement? I mean, to me, in my mind, it seems like when Reagan starts making these cuts, when they start me pro-corporation, all that, since then, it seems like a lot of the policies have been unpopular democratically. Like the majority of people want healthcare. The majority of people want certain things to happen, and they don't. So it's almost this kind of inevitable strategy that you have to, one, be completely in line. Everyone is lockstep. Every single Republican is lockstep. But two, keep the focus off of those issues in some way. Make it an emotional connection to the party. Make it about how bad the other group is, and make it kind of this, on top horse race journalism, whatever you want to call it, to distract people in that way. How, especially now in the age of alternative media and social media, all this stuff, how do you possibly, I guess, combat that? Is that making it local again?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it happens, and we're even seeing it happen at the time we tape this, when an administration, in this case President Trump, goes after very specific programs, or the Republicans go after a specific program like Medicaid. Regardless of the environment, it becomes very real to people. You're seeing that. You're seeing that with cuts to government workers. You're seeing that with cuts to programs. I think that automatically, that's a constant. You take things away that people like, that will trigger a response. Part of it is, I do think those who oppose that kind of politics have to learn to operate in that world. You can't imagine another world and say, I wish it was that, because it's not happening right now. And so they have to create, meaning proponents of these government programs or champions of more popular proposals, including things like restrictions on guns. They need to figure out how to get that message out in this new world, whether it's a podcast or whatever. I think that's a strategy they haven't always done very well. Conservatives have been very attuned to new media as it emerges, really kind of in an impressive way, where I think liberals and progressives often struggle in that world. And I think they're going to have to do that. And finally, they are going to have to focus on partisanship, meaning part of those who want to, if we're talking about the current moment, kind of defend against this continued onslaught against things that are popular, things that are necessary, will need to really, in this case, put pressure on a Democratic Party to represent them and represent them with force. That's still the best tool in Washington if you are an opponent of this presidency.
Yeah.
It's still the best tool in the end to checking what's going on. And so that relationship is important too.
Right, and it's also probably going to look a little bit, it's going to look gradual at first. It's going to be let's say one Republican who defects, or even one Democrat who defects from the party line and actually goes to a more progressive side or whatever. And I guess it's about not losing hope there. This also reminds me too of how the Republicans have shifted what politics is generally. I remember in 2012 when Romney ran, after Romney lost the election to Obama, there was a news story about Sheldon Adelson, major donor. His wife now is still, but it was basically like a ha-ha, I told you so. He spent like $50 million trying to get Romney elected and he lost. And there was this article, I think it was on CNN or something, that basically saying like, oh, look at this guy, he wasted all this money. But in reality, he didn't, because he's changing what politics means. It means you have to raise that money. Now you have to have millions of dollars just to run for a state court, Supreme Court in Wisconsin. Right. So in a way, I guess, it's another part of the big problem is campaign finance as well, I think, and having people defect over to, Republicans or Democrats to wanting to fix that as well.
It's a huge part. I mean, it's a huge part of the problem. And in the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, I mean, many people focused on the fact that Elon Musk spent the money, he wrote the checks and lost. And looked at it as a sign, a positive sign, money doesn't done it. But there was a lot of money in that race, and Democrats spent a lot of money. And so you're right, there too, the playing field's totally different. That doesn't change. Maybe he lost, but money didn't lose. And so you have a system where you need those kinds of dollars just to compete, and that's going to inherently squeeze out people who don't have that access. And we have a system where money does now equal campaign speech, and that's a big problem. And you're right. Even the losers still kind of. I mean, he has just set a whole new level of what you're going to spend on a judicial race. Period.
And not to mention, this goes back to the two-party system thing. This would be my one, I guess, my one concern is that if you're, let's say, a big donor, you can put money in just two parties.
Well, that's true.
And change it at least for what affects you. Granted, there's going to be differences on wedge issues, social issues, whatever. But as far as corporate policy, if I was Microsoft, I'd just give $20 million to both parties and I'd cover my bases. So in a way, our shift to the right, at least on corporate power and all that stuff, could be attributed a little bit to that.
No, absolutely. I mean, you have two things go on at once. You do have strong partisan differences in the country, but it's like the Cold War. There's areas of consensus. And because of the campaign finance and a ideological sympathy for decades now on the structure of the economy, that became less of a dividing line. So they were dividing over other issues, which were not all distractions, are very real, like reproductive rights, but some areas were off the table, and it is connected to that. I mean, one of the moves now that people talk about a lot is towards small dollar donations. And they say, look, getting rid of big money is going to be very hard right now. So in the immediate future, what you're seeing in states and some localities are incentives for people to give a few dollars, and it's matched by the government. And that's not a perfect system. It does encourage partisanship because people who give money tend to be most partisan, but it's a very different model. And some candidates, including Trump, and Sanders showed this, you can raise a lot of money pretty effectively. And so in the near future, I do think that's an important and interesting area of reform that could not end what you're talking about, but it is a countervailing pressure to that.
Yeah, and the hope would be that someone, let's say like Sanders, who's independent, but he runs under the Democratic Party, could slowly shift the party as well. I mean, a lot of the squad in Congress was a response to Trump's first election. They were elected right after. So I guess the hope within the two-party system is that they slowly... Although, on the other side, that same Democratic Party did freeze him out to a certain extent in 2016 and continues to kind of... But, going back to what we were talking about too, now he's taking it on the road. In-person, town halls and all that stuff as well. I was hoping you could talk a little bit, you mentioned this in the book as well, you talk about effective partisanship. And I think especially now, that's a very, it's basically like emotion based.
Yeah.
And now with people talking about, fascism, I don't want to say the word or whatever, but now with that, that's obviously a very important part of that kind of thing. I was wondering if you could talk about that and how we could possibly once again move away from something like that when it also benefits both parties so significantly.
I mean, I start the book with the scene in Larry David's Curb Your Enthusiasm where he spends the entire season trying to sleep with this actress, finally gets in her dressing room, they're kissing, and he looks and he sees, this is an old episode, a picture of President George W. Bush, and he stops kissing her and says, "You support Bush?" or something like that. And she says, "Yes, I'm a Republican, Larry." The music cues and he walks out. And so effective partisanship is kind of about that. It's about, it's so emotional that you can look at someone and you don't like them because you basically can see what party they're from. You know where they live, you know what they wear. And that is obviously not great. I mean, you can have strong parties where there are spaces where you get together. I mean, that's the whole idea of civic associations. And it's not nostalgic, You could really hate what someone represents politically, but play baseball with them in a park and still have a good time, or watch a sporting event, etc. So I don't think they're inextricably connected. That I don't know how you get rid of. I'm not a psychologist, but a lot of people are writing about that new level where we're entering, which is quite dangerous. I think the solution, again, I'm not as good at this, but I do still see non-political civic institutions, from religious to sports, to bowling leagues, as something that's really important toward healing some of that. Because I still think when you meet someone, not everyone, but some people, when you meet them face to face, even if they're politically very different, it's not the same. And that's a danger of social media too. I mean, the political engagement's intense because you don't see it's easy to say anything till you see the human in front of you. So I think those civic spaces are really something local leaders have to focus on, not just political leaders, but kind of wealthier people in a community and just citizens.
Yeah, and this reminds me of the book Bowling Alone, the famous Robert Putnam book, which is actually having a renaissance right now because of everything happening. Basically, the book says, in the 90s he wrote this about how people become more isolated, watching their own TV shows, all this stuff, and it's only gotten worse with social media, but it's basically this kind of calling for everyone to come back to these. Because it's true, I guess you have this, when you meet someone in person, you have a different type of connection, then you also can develop empathy that way and sympathy. You see the results of policies that you're cheerleading, you see all of these things, and it's the only way to really, the community being their part is, I guess, the only way to kind of maybe combat that. So, us two just sitting here talking may not be, but this is the beginning, all right? That's the beginning. So there was another part in this book where you were talking about how, I guess, to talk about Trump, there was a quote you referred to where Trump didn't hijack the Republican Party. He understood it. This is Ezra Klein, I think, said that. But you talk on this point because I think one of the things people don't realize, everyone's freaking out. Obviously, people that are on both sides are freaking out, and it's people kind of blame Trump completely. But it's funny because Jason Stanley, he's an authoritarian scholar and all this, he says that what Trump really did was he flipped a switch. The infrastructure was there. He kind of just flipped the switch that was already kind of put in place. I was hoping you could talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can see President Trump as a product or cause. And a cause argument, some believe, is that he changed the party. He changed the electorate. He changed everything. I don't see it that way. I mean, I think the changes had been bubbling up, as we discussed, within the GOP and outside of the GOP for decades. And by 2015 and 16, the nature of the Republican Party was pretty set. It had changed a lot already. Just with the Tea Party, you saw a lot of what he was going to do. And the reason he succeeded, the reason he gets the nominations twice, the reason he has such strong support in the Republican Party, the reason his messaging strategy is very effective, is because that system was in place. And he either flipped the switch or he just understood and took a deep dive into this very divided partisan and hyper-partisan political environment. If the Republicans didn't support Trump on Capitol Hill in 2025, as we speak, he would be in a vulnerable position. Even if some Republicans supported him, he would always have the threat of impeachment hanging over his head. He would have the threat of budget cuts hanging over his head. He doesn't have any of that, not because the Republicans have just said do whatever you want. They are actively supporting what he is doing. And I think if you see it that way, it's more about the Republican Party, the media environment, and that's why Trump is where he is at this point.
Right, right. Okay, and I was hoping you could also speak to what's happening now with I guess the universities.
Yeah.
So we've had partisanship before. We've had two parties at each other's throats before. How come it's kind of heading into that direction or that space? How come, I guess, whether it's censorship you want to talk about, or how is that? Why is that happening now around parties? I
mean, it's a really dangerous development, and I don't think that's a partisanship. This is an agenda by persons connected to the administration, including the president himself, a real disdain for knowledge and traditional institutions of knowledge. And it kind of ranges from attacking specific things like how you teach and study history, which is now all of a sudden a political issue, to just funding science so that scientists can have labs that provide us knowledge about cancer and Alzheimer's and develop drugs. And we have never had anything like this. I mean, in the 50s, you had a bipartisan consensus form that funding research and leaving education content alone was how you get the best universities. And lo and behold, we have them. We have examples where much of the world looks here. And I think the Republican Party, part of the change you've seen, this is one of the areas they're really going after. So some of it's ideological. Some of it, I think, is also political, meaning I think the president and some Republicans see the university as a source of opposition. The ideas that emerge don't mesh with what they want to talk about or their political agenda. So what do? As you do with law firms, as you do with courts, you try to knock them out at their knees. So then you can go further in what you wanted to do. So I think that's where we are. But it's very, I think, threatening to these institutions.
Is it a cultural fix that needs to happen? Do people need to realize culturally that these things are important? Or is there actually policy that can be passed in the current climate to fix these kinds of things?
It's both. I mean, the only the only difference I would say is people of wealth and people of business have traditionally valued the universities. You don't get Silicon Valley without government funding for Stanford. Very simple. I mean, that is all connected. And a lot of our kind of sources of strength in the economy are connected to universities. So they have understood that they and their kids, including our president and vice president, went to universities. So I think they get that. I think it is more cultural. I do think it's incumbent on people, certainly in the world of education, from lower schools to higher education, to defend what they do and to explain what they do. Because we're in a cultural moment where a lot of people, they've thrown their hands up and they don't get it. They think their kids are in second grade learning how to be kind of radical activists instead of learning basics of history. And they think in higher education the same. And so some of it's going to have to be defending what this entire system does and explaining it. I think there's a lot of myths, not about the content even, but about what goes on in the classrooms that have to be refuted. But there will have to be policy changes. At this point, the best bet is going to be within the states to really step up governors who understand some of this is not permissible. But it's a tough fight, I'll tell you, because federal dollars really matter to the entire educational system. And so if someone's willing to really cut those, it's hard to fight back. It's a hard fight to have, but you have to, because this is crucial to our kids.
Well, not to mention the fact that in the past 30, even beginning, like let's say with Reagan, all that, cuts to schools and things have come anyway. And so they rely more on private donations. And who do those private donations come from? The wealthiest people in the country. So they also, in a way, have been censoring or whatever, kind of curating what these universities have been talking about or how they've been talking as well for decades now. Well, yeah, I guess what you were saying, you were talking about myths. I don't know if that was a subtle way to move into your other book, Myth America. Hello. That's a pro right here.
Right.
But yeah, you wrote the book Myth America, and I think that it's a great book. I guess it tells the history of the United States pretty much in a way, going myth by myth, different times in history, and kind of debunking that through one of the experts in that. area. And as far as these myths, I guess debunking the myth, maybe this goes back to what we were talking about before. The beginning would be people being out in the real world with each other and speaking in a way that isn't, just getting at each other's throats and all that. And then once again affecting policy and politics and politicians to where maybe one defects, maybe two defect, and then slowly change the system that way. I guess right now, I don't know if you could speak to maybe the sense of urgency that has now kind of presented itself, where the stakes are a little higher when you do have this assault on universities, freedom of speech, all these different things. How can that happen faster? I guess is really the question. Is there a way?
Look, I'm not a politician, so I do think, like, in the first 2 weeks that this all started with the new administration, it's true it's been going on for a while, but it's intensified in a dramatic way. A lot of people were pretty quiet. Everyone was like holding their heads down and don't want to get in the crossfire. And then people realized it's coming after everyone. So you've had more leaders in universities starting to write op-eds or speak about why this is terrible. That's a very important thing, and it takes a certain amount of bravery in this day and age because you don't know what's going to come out. My role is different. I'm just a writer, a teacher, so I do focus on just teaching good history, not partisan history. I'm trying just to kind of give people a sense of what the actual stories are, even when there's debates about how to interpret them, and keep the argument shaped around that as opposed to just manufactured myths and falsehoods. And that's hard to do, and this is not an intentional plug. I mean, I even started this Substack. I started it now, it's not a total surprise, and it's called The Long View with the purpose of that, of trying to just be part of a conversation so that people who are interested in history can get it from a source that's, I think, I'm pretty solid. And I think it's small steps like that. I mean, that then goes to the activists who, over one weekend, came out onto the streets in large numbers saying this is not good, and saying, get your hands off this, get your hands. Each person's just one person, but it's the stepping out in whatever capacity you have that I think is important. And so in the world of intellectual life, that's how I think about it. And I think that different people have to play those roles now, but you can't wait. I don't know how you get results fast, but I do believe pressure works, and being vocal works. And it takes an amount of bravery. You can't just hide. When these kinds of changes are happening so dramatically, you have to kind of focus on the now, not the future.
Yeah, no, and speaking to those like protests or just being out and doing these things, it's easy to write off the intangible effects of those things. Obviously, that protest may not have changed the world, like policy-wise or anything, but every person who goes out there, there are thousands of people interacting, realizing they're not alone, thinking of other things they can do, being exposed to different nonprofits or whatever they can get involved with. And it's just, that's the slow build that I think it is easy to overlook.
That's how the civil rights movement worked. I mean, it wasn't as if success came on day one. What civil rights, when you study the movements, it was thousands of little protests in places like Mississippi or Alabama, where the results were, they're actually not very positive. People were arrested, people were attacked, or nothing happened. The protest happened, the next day everything was the same. Jim Crow remained in place. But gradually that built awareness, it built political pressure, and it breaks with the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65. But that's many years in the making. And it doesn't have to be that long, but it is a reminder that activism and protest sometimes is just about kind of creating momentum, energy, and awareness, as opposed to immediate next day results.
Yeah, and Noam Chomsky talks about this in I guess in relation to the Vietnam War. He said that the protests there, I mean, people obviously in the 70s, people were, can state all these big things, but he was talking about how it began with people in living rooms. Trying to figure out, just like a group of 6 people, like, what do we do? What do we do? And then obviously it took a long time, but that was like in the early 60s, he said, and then it becomes a bigger thing. So yeah, it's just a matter of getting out there and talking to different people and all that stuff. So that's good. So is that kind of what you would say gives you hope with everything? You see people out, you see people interacting, you have these, let's say like on your Substack, not to plug your Substack again, Long View, you got to check it out. But are these the things that give you hope?
They do. I mean, I get hope just studying history and
Yeah.
seeing how resilient people in the country can be. Even people from different political perspectives can ultimately fight for the health of the institutions. And I see some of that now. I still believe there will be responses as the reality of what's happening takes place. And you're seeing some of that now. And I get, look, for me, it's my students who I see all the time, and they give me energy because they are kind of laser focused on their future world, and they're not just kind of rolling over to whatever the country gives. So I do see signs of hope. But for me, ultimately, history, which has a lot of bad things, it has a lot of terrible, terrible moments, and I teach those. But it also has incredible stories of resiliency. I'm teaching a class in Princeton on the U.S. since the 70s, and part of the class looks at the history of the gay rights movement, which is just an incredible story to move from the Stonewall protests in 1969, when police are just raiding and arresting people randomly for being in a bar, to the legalization of same-sex marriage by the Supreme Court in the 2010s, which isn't a huge amount of space, to the point where even today, with all the horribly divisive politics over trans issues in the ad and the campaign, some areas aren't even like same-sex marriage thus far have kind of just been institutionalized. And that's a story where movement activists changed the country. So I look at that, and for me, those kinds of stories are important to giving me a sense of where things can go that aren't totally dire or aren't totally destructive.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very true. And like you said, there are terrible things, but there are also great stories of resilience, which for a story of resilience, by definition, you need difficulty.
Correct.
You need a tough situation. So I guess we're kind of in that right now. And you kind of mentioned this earlier before, but I kind of wanted to highlight it is you're not going to get away from it. You can't run away from it. I mean, this is happening in the United States, and it's so funny. You hear people talking about, well, I'm going to move, I'm going to leave, I'm going to whatever, but I mean, it's going to get to where you're going eventually. This is something, the United States is too big of a player. It's also happening everywhere else. The same movement is happening everywhere else.
I wrote, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
I mean, Martin Luther King wrote the famous letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963, and the focus wasn't the racist extremists, it was the moderate who did nothing.
Yeah.
And he was talking about moderate preachers in particular, and he said they are the ones who actually allow this to happen by turning their head away, by not doing anything. And I wrote a book about a rabbi named Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a civil rights activist in the 60s and an anti-war activist. And he also talked about kind of indifference being a more insidious evil than the people who are committing it. And it's both kind of morally terrible, and I think bankrupts us when people do that and turn their head away. But it's also impossible to escape, especially today in a global age where these political forces we're talking about are everywhere. The kind of notion of escape is problematic on its own, but I think it's also just problematic in being realistic and important wherever you are, whatever country you're in, is not disengaging from these broader struggles.
Yeah, we're all connected. It's happening everywhere. I don't think that's an accident. Well, that's great. I mean, I don't know. I think we kind of solved everything, Julian. I think we did it. I think we solved all the world problems. I mean, is there any parting thoughts? I mean, is there anything that, I guess you wrote this book, Myth America, that talks about the different myths in history and the way we're taught history. Is there anything, I guess, before we wrap up here? Is there any myth or something that you think people, you wish people were aware as a myth, or is there anything you would like people to maybe reconsider, or something in particular you talk to your students about?
I mean, it's not a myth from the book, and nor is it something in my class, but there's a myth of inevitability that is really harmful in politics, a sense that it's going to happen the way it seems like it's going to happen. And many people feel that way right now. That then becomes politically paralyzing. And I think the great leaders, the great movers who move the country in a good direction rejected that inevitability. I mean, Martin Luther King in his 63 address in Washington, talks about the fierce urgency of now. And he was saying, don't wait. It's not about waiting, and it's not about eventually things will work out. It's about right now taking action to make sure that's true. And so if there's a myth that I think we have to just put aside right now, and always put aside, it's that myth of inevitability. Sorry about that. I didn't turn it off. Do you want me to
that was a perfect cue right there. No, that was a perfect cue. You were getting riled up.
Little Billy strings. Just the myth of inevitability is something that in politics is very important to avoid. And I think leaders want that myth to hold, because if a lot of people believe something is inevitable, then they will turn away and go about their business and just assume that's where we're going to head.
That's great. Well, that was wow. That was something. I think you kind of summed it all up. We solved everything pretty much. So nothing really left here to do except for maybe you could sign my book.
Of course, of course.
Here you go. Get you a little page there and a little pen here.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for having me on this.
Thank you for coming around. We came to you, so yeah, thank you for having us. Yeah. but thank you so much for having us, and your books are great. You guys should check them out. In Defense of Partisanship, edited Myth America, as well as many other books. You can check out his Substack.
Thank you.
Which is very good. The Long View, also very good. But yeah, thank you so much, Julian.
Thanks.
I really appreciate it.
Great conversation.
Yeah, it was good. That was good. I think. How'd I stack up with like the CNN anchors and stuff?
Excellent. Excellent.
All right, that's a perfect place to end. Well, thank you guys for watching, and see you guys later. Great.
All right.
How was that?
Excellent. That was great. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that was great.
You're a good interviewer.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.